Venezuela has just suffered its worst natural tragedy since the Holy Thursday earthquake of 1812. This video is made in order to help the hundreds of thousands of people affected by the two earthquakes that Venezuela experienced on June 24, 2026, and also in order to document our national history so that we can seriously learn from the successes, the mistakes, and how we should act as a country in the face of these kinds of situations. Exactly north of the capital, Caracas, just across Mount El Avila, in a paradisiacal coastal strip that opens up to the Caribbean Sea, lies the territory known as Vargas. Throughout almost the entire Republican history of Venezuela, it became a national center of pleasant experiences and memories for millions of Venezuelans and foreigners. Although its official name was changed to La Guaira State in 2019, days after then-President Maduro confused the name of the state on national television. For more than a century, Vargas had always been its official name as a department that was part of the federal district, and in 1998 it was finally established as an independent state called Vargas State, the 23rd state of the nation. Vargas is a very narrow strip of land, just a few kilometers wide between the sea and the mountains. Wedged between the Caribbean Sea and the steep slopes of Mount El Avila, with inclines that in some places exceed 30 degrees, the heart of Vargas has always been the town and the port. La Guaira, a name that has also been colloquially used to refer to this entire area. Since the port of La Guaira was founded in 1589 to serve as the port of entry for Caracas, its mother city, La Guaira has been, from then until now, the main gateway in and out of Venezuela. In modern times, it is home to one of the two main ports in the country, along with Puerto Cabello, and the site of the nation's most important airport. Although, due to the narrowness of the coastal strip, La Guaira has always been separated from the capital, Caracas, by a mountain barrier that could only be crossed in colonial times by a mule trail. With a road in 1945, with a railroad in 1883, and by 1953 with a modern highway built during the period of the new national ideal. But that same geography that made Vargas so prosperous also made it extremely vulnerable. Its small rivers and streams, which originate in the peaks of El Avila, more than 2,600 meters high, flow down short, very steep courses toward the sea. Under normal conditions, they are harmless streams of water. But under extreme conditions, they become deadly conveyor belts of mud, rocks, and logs. For this reason, Vargas State was never built on a solid plain, but rather on what are called alluvial fans, which are large, cone-shaped mountains of sediment that stretch from El Avila to the sea. This risky reality had already been noted at other times in history. For example, in 1951, there was a landslide, although it was small in scale, with very few houses affected. Even so, the authorities at the time already warned that the Central Coast should not be an area for mass habitation, but rather dedicated mainly to port trade, tourism, and vacationing. That is why geological and biological realities are not separate from social and political reality. And another important example of this is how, from 1958 until the year of the first Vargas tragedy, in 1999, after 40 years of poor urban planning during the party democracy, both residential developments and large slums were built on a massive scale in high-risk areas of Vargas State. Hundreds of thousands of people ended up crowded together on the alluvial fans that those same rivers had formed over centuries of previous landslides. This created a scenario of geological and social fragility. This created a scenario in a nation that was in increasing decline, but still enjoyed levels of well-being and wealth inherited from previous decades. a prosperity that could be seen every weekend in clubs like those at Playa Grande or Puerto Azul, on beaches like Alibaba or Pelua, and in places like El Rey del Pescado Frito or Margaret's Arepas. And in that year, 1999, Venezuela was also experiencing a unique social and political moment. The democratic regime of almost 40 years was coming to an end, with the rise of Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez Frias, a military strongman who had led a failed coup d'etat and who promised to found a new republic and put an end to the previous one. Hugo Chavez had won the presidential elections in December 1998, and one of his fundamental promises for that new Venezuela was the creation of a new constitution. And December 15, 1999, was the date set for the national referendum, which would either ratify or reject that new constitution. But Venezuelan and world history will remember a very different episode on that date. Days before that date, on December 2, a first wave of rain hit, dropping 200 millimeters of water on the Vargas coast. In the following days, there were constant rains. They kept falling over Vargas state, hinting at the storm that was about to come. It was between December 13 and 16, 1999, when the heavens came down on Vargas. That Monday, December 13, a rain began that would not stop for 52 hours, during which 911 millimeters of water fell, which is almost the average rainfall for an entire year in the country. The already saturated ground couldn't absorb another drop. During the 2 days of intense rain, December 13 and 14, alarms and warnings of a possible natural crisis in La Guaira started going off. Thus, the fateful 15th arrived amid many fears, and this was not just another ordinary day. In parallel with the heavy rains, as we mentioned, Venezuelans were called to the polls to vote in the referendum that would approve the new constitution promoted by the National Constituent Assembly controlled by Chavismo.
Thus, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has been born.
And
happily, despite the tragedies, here is the new constitution for that Bolivarian Republic.
those were the very words of Hugo Chavez on the day that the definitive triumph of his incipient revolution was to be consecrated. And while the rainfall was intensifying on the coast, the pressure to suspend the voting was growing due to the warnings that had been issued. Chavez decides not to stop the process, and he quotes the phrase attributed to Simon Bolivar during the Caracas earthquake of 1812, which we will talk about later. If nature opposes us, we will fight against it and make it obey us. So the process went on, and the day passed along with the continuing rains. Finally, on the night of December 15, 1999, around 8 p.m., what Venezuelans remember as the day the mountain came all the way to the sea began. That night of the 15th, the rains kept saturating the mountain soil, and thousands of shallow landslides suddenly tore away the earth, rocks, and vegetation from the slopes of El Avila. The water liquefied those materials into what geologists call debris flows, torrents of mud as dense as fresh concrete, rocks the size of buses, and whole tree trunks began rushing down at devastating speeds straight toward the coastal towns. Most of the inhabitants of those towns could do little when they noticed the huge mass of mud advancing toward their homes, if they even noticed it at all. Neighborhoods like Los Corrales were buried under 3 meters of mud. Entire towns like Carmen de Uria and Cerro Grande literally disappeared from the map with the successive landslides that kept happening, swept into the ocean, along with many of their residents who suffered the same fate. The few who managed to escape the currents that early morning were left in the darkness without power, standing in a cemetery of mud, most of them already without a home and with no one to turn to. Some families from areas not yet affected managed to evacuate, but the landslides continued to hit different towns throughout that early morning. Others climbed onto the roof of their house to escape the violent currents and waited there for a possible rescue. By the morning of December 16th, the sun had already risen, but the rains and mud flows were still ongoing, leaving tragic scenes that were seen across the country on broadcast television. Finally, the last debris flows were reported between 8 and 9 in the morning on December 16th, when the disaster had already spread to 11 states in the country. That same day, the 16th, in the midst of chaos, the National Constituent Assembly declared a state of emergency. The roads in the Vargas neighborhood had been completely blocked by landslides. In the midst of the emergency, there were also reports of looting, vandalism, and growing anarchy in the state. The day after, on December 17th, the air rescue began in the face of an extremely complex situation, and with the roads cut off. Children and the elderly are the first to be evacuated from the area, followed by adult women and then men, many of whom are still trapped in the floodwaters, with the hope of at least staying alive. That same day, troops and security forces from the National Guard, the Army, and the D-Ship are sent, who dedicate themselves tirelessly to rescuing victims, as well as to neutralizing outbreaks of anarchy and crime that were plaguing the devastated communities. Another controversial episode breaks out when, very shortly after the disaster becomes known, the government of the United States of America offers support with a rescue team and humanitarian aid to Venezuela. And although the Venezuelan government initially accepts heavy machinery and logistical support from the United States, Hugo Chavez later publicly and controversially rejects it. A contingent of 450 Marines and naval engineers that the United States had offered to send, claiming that foreign troops were not needed for Venezuela to handle the emergency. While the rescue operations are underway, the images and videos of the tragedy on television move the entire nation. The cries of the families who had lost everything, parents looking for their children, children looking for their parents, entire towns full of real human lives and histories disappeared in a matter of seconds. The exact magnitude of the first Vargas tragedy remains an unsolved mystery to this day, a number difficult to calculate when entire families perish. The government officially recognized between 1,500 and 3,000 deaths. Later, unofficial estimates have put the number between 10,000, 16,000, and even 30,000 deaths, mostly including missing persons in those estimates. This last figure would make the Vargas landslide enter the Guinness Book of Records as the deadliest mudslide ever recorded. Meanwhile, other recent academic estimates have put the number of deaths at less than 1,000. The truth is that besides the deaths and material damage, the tragedy left around 100,000 people affected, and more than 130,000 evacuees who suddenly had to put their lives on hold in Vargas state. In Caracas, there are also hundreds of people affected in areas on the slopes of El Avila, such as San Bernardino, Lidich, Cotiza, and others. The exact truth will never be known. There was never a reliable census of how many people lived in those areas that were wiped out before the mud ended their lives. What is known is that after the Vargas landslide, it was never the same again. It lost population, it lost infrastructure, it carried a somber atmosphere for years, and it remained as an open geological and emotional wound. After the landslide, Vargas state slowly recovered and became once again a sunny paradise where millions of Venezuelans gathered. And so, a quarter of a century later, the year 2026 arrived in Venezuela. During Hugo Chávez's presidency, the country had undergone a severe decline of its economy, its social fabric, and its institutions. This widespread deterioration also seriously affects the efficiency of the national emergency system for seismic contingencies. It also affects the number of trained personnel available to respond to emergencies or natural disasters. It also affects, in some cases, construction standards for projects. And It affects a large part of the existing infrastructure in the nation that does not receive proper maintenance, in addition to earthquake-resistant regulations that have not been updated since 2001. And in terms of urban planning in Vargas State, shortly after 1999, they were built again. Large residential complexes, as well as large slums in risky areas of the state. This is how 2026 arrived, which, just like the year 1999, became a unique social and political moment for the nation. The U.S. military operation on January 3rd and the new relationship between Venezuela and the United States generate new enthusiasm and hope for the country's future in many sectors. Enthusiasm that hadn't been felt in a long time, but they say fate is fickle. And right on the national holiday, God and nature will put the Venezuelan people to a new test in this long 40-year wilderness. To understand the natural disaster that Venezuela was about to experience, we must first know that 80% of the Venezuelan population lives in a high seismic risk zone, a zone that lies on the boundary between two huge tectonic plates, the Caribbean plate and the South American plate, two plates that slide against each other along a complex fault system, among which the Bocanó Fault, the San Sebastian Fault, and the El Pilar Fault stand out. Friction or tension builds up between those plates for decades or even centuries, and earthquakes happen when that accumulated tension is released after all that time. The only earthquake more devastating than the one Venezuela just experienced is the one that happened in the country on March 26, 1812, Holy Thursday of Holy Week. Almost a year after Venezuela had declared its independence as a republic from the Spanish crown. That Holy Thursday, the earthquake struck along the Bocanó Fault and destroyed much of Caracas, La Guaira, Mérida, and San Felipe. Since it was a religious date during Holy Week, the churches were especially full of worshipers when they collapsed due to the earthquake. That earthquake from almost 2 centuries ago left between 20,000 and 30,000 people dead. To give us an idea of the disaster, a quarter of the population of Caracas died in that traumatic event. And although it's not widely known, according to experts in geology, it's very likely that the Venezuela earthquake of 1812 was also a double seismic event, just like the one in 2026. An event of almost impossible statistical probability when two earthquakes of similar magnitude occur almost simultaneously. On the afternoon of Wednesday, June 24, 2026, Venezuela was commemorating not a religious date like in 1812, but a national holiday, the Battle of Carabobo, which had sealed the country's independence. Because it was a holiday, many more people than usual had gone down to La Guaira to enjoy the day off. And since it was late in the afternoon on a holiday, many were at home. It was 6:04 in the afternoon, and Android phones all over the country automatically emitted a sound alert. They were getting closer, and at the moment when they used the accelerometers of more than 2,000, they were getting closer to the street. And at the moment, improvised seismographs, and indeed just a few seconds, Venezuelans begin to feel the start of an earthquake. It was the first earthquake with a magnitude of 7.2 with its epicenter near San Felipe, the capital of Yaracuy State. The ground starts to move continuously in small distances that become longer and stronger every second. Nervous laughter turns into extreme fear. And at the 39th second, while the earth is still shaking and objects are moving, the second shock hits. 3 or 4 bursts of movement, but among the most violent anyone had ever seen, shake the earth from side to side, violently and by more than a meter, knocking people down, almost flipping cars, and bringing down large buildings in a matter of seconds. Millions of Venezuelans see their lives flash before their eyes in just a few seconds. What they had just witnessed was a second earthquake with a magnitude of 7.5 with its epicenter in Umari, the most powerful one Venezuela had recorded in its history since the year 1900. After the second jolt, amid the roar of the earth and falling objects, the intensity of the tremor starts to decrease, but it continues for about 20 more seconds until it finally stops. After the impact of the first earthquake, what comes with the second is a cascade of collapses and human tragedies. The streets fill with frightened citizens who had run out of their buildings, and when they see the collapsed structures in front of their eyes for the first time, they are left in a state of disbelief and trauma. They know they didn't just feel a minor tremor. Around 10 buildings in Greater Caracas collapsed,
Edificaciones colapsan al instante.
especially in the parishes of San Bernardino and Altamira. Among them, the tall and iconic Petunia building in Los Palos Grandes. At the same time, thousands of structures in the country's capital are seriously or considerably affected, such as schools, residences, and business towers. The Caracas Cathedral suffers visible cracks in its bell tower. The Santa Capilla Basilica suffers severe damage to its altar. The tower of the San Juan Church loses the cross that crowned it, and it is undoubtedly in Vargas state where the greatest devastation occurs. With the impact of the second earthquake, around 800 buildings in Vargas collapse completely or partially in a matter of seconds, while thousands more structures are seriously affected. Tens of thousands are instantly left with their homes uninhabitable. The heart and historic center of La Guaira, Catia Lamar, Maiquitia, Tanago Arenas, and other iconic areas are left completely devastated amid huge clouds of dust and the screams of people trapped under the rubble. The Maiquitia International Airport, the main gateway to the country, and many other buildings suffer significant structural damage. Other towns such as Tucacas in Falcon State and Moron in Carabobo State also suffer significant damage, with collapsed structures, people left homeless, and fatalities. On the first night, as images of the devastation begin to circulate on social media, the scale of the disaster starts to become clear both nationally and worldwide. During the first 48 and even 72 hours after the earthquake, many residents report not having received any support from the state for rescuing those who were trapped. Or in other cases, they report inexperience or a lack of knowledge in handling these situations among the officials who came down to help. For her part, the acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, states that she immediately activated the National Emergency Plan, and that faced with thousands of buildings that collapsed instantly, with people trapped and many of the roads blocked, it was impossible to respond to every collapsed building immediately. The truth is that without waiting for help or permission from anyone, what happened in the following hours and days became one of the main acts of human solidarity ever witnessed in the history of Venezuela. Venezuela, in an impoverished, fragmented country where many have little, even so, the Venezuelan people rushed to help the victims. Neighbors and strangers alike left everything behind to dedicate themselves to clearing rubble and searching for people and animals alike, many of whom were trapped. Thousands of Venezuelans, both inside and outside the central region, traveled with whatever they had by their own means to Caracas and Vargas to help with their own hands in all the rescue and support efforts for the tens of thousands of victims. Networks are organized independently both inside and outside the country to send donations, supplies, and to transport volunteers to feed the rescuers and support those affected. La Guaira and the most affected parishes of Caracas are crowded, but it's because of the massive support they receive from the rest of the country. Meanwhile, dozens of countries announced they will send aid and logistical support, and although they also managed to mobilize about 48 or 72 hours after the event, the arrival of these missions in La Guaira is a great relief for many. Thus, images begin to emerge of children and elderly people being miraculously rescued after spending days and even more than a week trapped under the concrete. There are also painful scenes of those who confirmed a loved one's death. At the time this video is being recorded, the Venezuelan government officially reports 3,000 to 3,500 deaths, while other estimates put the number at more than 10,000 deaths. Among the countries sending support are the United States, Spain, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Israel, France, Mexico, China, India, Qatar, and others. Together with civil protection members, Venezuelan firefighters and special groups from the Venezuelan Armed Forces have been carrying out rescue operations for more than 10 days using the tools available to them. At the same time, the streets and squares of Vargas and Caracas are filling up with victims who are sleeping in tents or out in the open. It is estimated that there are tens of thousands of victims and more than 1 million people in the central region, whose homes have been considerably affected in a nation where most people have no savings and are economically impoverished. And just as we see the best of Venezuelans, the demons are also unleashed. During the first 2 days after the earthquakes, looting was reported in different parts of La Guaira. And on Thursday, after the double earthquake, word spread that a tsunami was coming. An alarm that would later be proven false, but that night it left all the affected areas abandoned, with thousands of survivors still trapped under the rubble. On one hand, there are videos circulating of Venezuelan state personnel helping with various rescue and public order operations. But on the other hand, there are also videos of officers who, dishonoring the symbols of their uniforms, engage in theft and looting in the midst of the tragedy, several of whom have been properly expelled from their respective organizations. At the same time, in those first days, the idea of social unrest begins to spread, and a major social and political controversy erupts, while thousands of Venezuelans remain under the rubble. News spreads that the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, is returning from exile to Venezuela. But the United States government, to the disappointment of some and the relief of others, rejects the return of the opposition leader. According to these media outlets, the United States government and President Donald Trump would have considered her return untimely in the midst of the tragedy. And in the midst of the controversy, U.S. diplomacy publicly comes out to support the work of the armed forces and the Venezuelan regime. But beyond the political controversy, the only priority for the people on the ground in the disaster areas is to rescue as many fellow citizens as possible by any means and against whoever stands in the way. The situation in Vargas during those first days of the tragedy became a scene of major disorder and a public order crisis. In that situation, on Friday, the militarization of Vargas was announced by the Minister of the Interior, Diosdado Cabellos, and immediately after, the Venezuelan army formally took control of Vargas. A first contingent of the United States Army arrives in Venezuela, along with the head of the Southern Command and the USS Fort Lauderdale of the U.S. Navy docked at the port of La Guaira. And a few days later, 900 Marines arrive in Vargas State, bringing the total to about 2,000 U.S. troops deployed on Venezuelan territory. According to some, the United States may be openly militarizing strategic sites in Venezuela, such as the port of La Guaira and the Maiquetía Airport, where U.S. military personnel have already set up a provisional base and are working side by side with Venezuelan authorities and officers. This is one of several signs of the historic and unprecedented times we are living through as a nation. After the first few days, for more than a week following the event, search and rescue efforts continue, with great displays of solidarity that keep multiplying throughout the country. At the same time, the smell of corpses in the streets around the collapsed buildings is becoming increasingly unbearable in parts of La Guaira. After the panic and the initial shock have passed, the feeling in Caracas, in Vargas, and in different parts of the country is one of sadness, pain, and trauma. While the last people are being rescued who, even after 12 or 13 days under the rubble, miraculously remained alive. Starting on Sunday, 10 days after the tragedy, a deep and heavy silence reigns in La Guaira, which grows deeper each day in what seems like a deserted city. There are reports of between 10 and 20,000 people still missing, or even more. According to some testimonies, the presence of the state in La Guaira is currently very low. Hundreds of families are still searching on their own for the remains of their relatives, and thousands of other families don't know when they will have a home again. Beyond all the deductions and speculations about the causes of the disaster, which are legitimate to make, through a serious and thorough technical study, it is possible to precisely determine moral and criminal responsibilities, if there are any, of those cases where the buildings may not have been constructed following the proper standards, or cases where the proper soil evaluation may not have been done, or cases where everything may have been properly followed, but the double earthquake exceeded all calculations. Natural disasters cannot be predicted, but we do have the ability to prepare for events that we know will come sooner or later. The real tragedy is not the earthquake, but that it happens in a country where the vast majority have very little in their pockets, where they don't even have electricity, water, and other basic services for their daily needs on a regular basis. The tragedy is a weakened state, with its capabilities reduced to a minimum, when the nation is besieged from within and from outside. Even so, the Venezuelan people have risen up in the face of adversity, showing that patriotic heroism that still beats strongly in our identity. And now it is everyone's duty to put into practice everything we've learned from this experience. For some, the 1999 landslide and the earthquakes of 2026 were simply accidental and random events. For others, they represent the beginning and end of a historical cycle that Venezuela has finally closed for good.